Well, thanks for the invitation to speak today. Sorry I can't be there with you. It may not necessarily be a bad thing. I'm here to talk about breaking out of silo thinking within the sort of placemaking and planning perspective. So I'm going to do that in a way which I will try and provide a bit of context for the approaches we currently have for planning and placemaking just now at a very high level. I then want to talk about 4 opportunities and challenges which we have, which I think can help us to break down that silo thinking and that silo-based action as well. I must stress that the things that we're saying may not always be the views of the RTPI. They may sometimes be, but they may not always be the views of the RTPI. So the 4 things I want to talk about in terms of context are, firstly, outcomes, and the fact that we're working within an outcomes-focused approach in Scotland. Second, I want to talk a wee bit about perception, and the perception of planners, planning system and placemaking, and how that impacts into it. I then want to talk a wee bit about how our systems are structured just now and how we use them, and what implications that has for how we work across silos. And I want to talk a wee bit in the context around skills and competencies that we have and we're meant to have, we're trained to have as planners as well. So, cutting to the chase, outcomes. I personally think there's a real positive aspect to Scottish Government these days is the way we take an outcomes-based approach. I'm a great fan of it. There are lots of things going on which make us think in this outcomes-based way, which is good for trying to break down silos. We've got the National Performance Framework, the other NPF, the National Performance Framework, which sets out a national purpose, which has 16 national outcomes, which is 45 national indicators. And one of the outcomes includes something about creating sustainable places. So there's a framework where it sets a context for this outcomes-based approach at a local level, which is taken through community planning partnerships and single outcome agreements as well. And it provides us with a focus on what we're trying to achieve, rather than just thinking of the process to get that. The thing that I really like about the outcomes-based approach is it really gives us the flexibility to work out how we can achieve those outcomes based upon the needs of a specific place, a specific circumstance, or a specific set of circumstances as well. And what it does, I think, is it challenges you as a professional to show the value which you bring, what role you can play in helping to achieve that outcome as well, and the contribution you can make. So it's a real opportunity, and it forces you to work with other professions because they're dealing with very, very complex problems and complex issues, and that means we have to take more complex approaches to it as well. So that outcomes-based approach is a really useful framework for us to be working within. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of context is the way in which we use the planning system just now, the way in which it functions. And despite what we've been trying to do through the 2006 Planning Act, to try and move things much more upstream to a much more collaborative planning process, I think we are still tending to see much of our work being focused on the reactive rather than proactive. And I suppose the question to ask is that too late? Should we be pushing things much more upstream? Where planners provide the vision? Will they engage with the players, the stakeholders, the communities, to provide certainty, to flush out what the issues are, and to articulate and work with them to provide different solutions to things as well? And if you do that, does that mean at the back end of the system, the development management side, if you've got this certainty and predictability built in early on, should that make that part of the system quicker, easier, and easier to handle as well? And the pie chart talks about 80-20, and I think the reason that's sort of there is because essentially just now, if you look at it, roughly 80% of the resources go to the development management side and 20% to the development planning side. A very rough calculation. And is that the right place? Where do we add most value? Should we be thinking about shifting that balance a wee bit? The other thing about systems is that one of my gripes is that as professionals we tend to talk about the planning system as if it is the one solution to the different challenges which we face. And I think we need to start thinking about how we are there to create great places for people as professionals. The planning system is one of the tools which we have to do that. But there are other tools out there which we have to use to try and achieve these different things, and they are non-statutory elements of what we're trying to do to achieve placemaking as well. So we need to think beyond the statutory, and I personally think that the non-statutory aspects are some of the places where we can actually have the most impact these days just now as well. So that idea of how we use the system is another important part of the context. if you've seen me speak before, I use this slide all the time, but there's a big thing for me about the perception of planning and planners. Quite often planners' perceptions of what they do and where they stand and what value they bring are quite different from others. I think quite often we are seen as the regulatory function rather than the visionary function. We can often be seen as bureaucratic, reactive, and the focus, people tend to think of planners as development management aspects of things rather than the sort of the other side of things. That's important, no doubt it's important, it's really important. But do we need to think about how we, what other parts of the system we deal with and how we articulate that? And I think it's important that to ask the question, particularly in local government, is where does corporate management, what does corporate management think about planners? Does it actually realise the benefit that we can bring, the value we can bring, the role that we can play, and helping them to achieve their own goals, their aspirations, through providing a vision and linking that vision to delivery as well. And key to that, which I'll touch on later on, is things such as single outcome agreements and community planning partnerships as well, and the role of planning in this, so that's important. And the fourth element of context, another slide I use a lot, is the idea of competencies and skills. And we tend to talk about the planners as if we're one homogeneous lump, all doing the same thing. But I think we have to realise, and we have to get others to realise, that we have different roles to play. We have different skill sets, we have different knowledge sets. We are trained to think strategically. We are trained to think long term. We are trained to think holistically. And these are the type of skills which are really important within the context we're talking about. So we need to get that message over that we're trained to think and work in this way, and allow people to give us the space to do that. So that's a sort of broad overview of the context. The question is, well, what should we be doing to try and make sure that we can link across different professions, disciplines, organisations and sectors? And I've got 4 challenges, stroke opportunities. It's up to you to decide if they're a challenge or an opportunity, but I think they're quite important. And the first of these I've touched on already, and it's the idea of corporate approaches. I've got no doubt that the large majority of planners want to work across silos. Corporate governments and corporate management teams in local government want to work across silos. So I think there's a real opportunity there for the profession to get better at demonstrating and articulating what we do to those corporate management teams in government, seeing how we can help them, how we can support them to achieve their roles, and how we can therefore be part of that corporate influence and how we take things forward. Just now we're tending to see heads of planning at 3rd tier in local authorities. Very few are at that 2nd tier corporate management level. So there's a job for us sometimes to try and push people up to that 2nd tier. I don't think that's always going to happen given the nature of the way local authorities work these days, but we have to get the messages over. We need to make sure people realise that the value and the benefits that we can bring are particularly important. And David Martin, who I'm not sure if he's been appointed Chief Executive or started his role as Chief Executive Dundee Council yet, or he's just about to, he spoke at the Heads of Planning Conference last year, talking about, he's a planner, he's a trained planner, but he's now Chief Exec, talking about how planners should be banging down the doors of corporate management team to show them the roles and the value that they could play, and he's got experience that from his previous job in Renfrewshire. So there's people that want to do that. I was in a meeting yesterday with Mike McKenzie, MSP, who was talking about the need to put planning central to this, to try and make sure we took that broader approach to things as well. So that idea of trying to grasp the corporate governance agenda can help us to provide a context for taking those things forward. Linked to that is the idea of trying to make sure that people think in a more spatial way. The problem we tend to have just now is that governments, local authorities, most organisations tend to think in terms of programmes and funding streams, in specific issues, very sort of vertical ways. And what we need to do is think in a much more spatial way. And that, I think, can make sure we look across different silos and different ways of doing things as well. So if you think of it, the way politicians work in local governments, they're given a committee, which is an education committee, or a social work committee, which is a silo. We don't have committees that necessarily always look at the things in the round as well. And there are opportunities in there. I've mentioned single outcome agreements, and I've mentioned community planning partnerships and community plans. They're outcome focused vehicles. The problem is, quite more often than not, they're not drafted in a spatial context. They're still looked at in terms of programmes, funding, issues. And I suppose I would ask is, can we start changing that? And I think that would help us take a much more holistic approach to how we planned our places. For example, could the development plan become the spatial articulation of a community plan? Can we join up community and stakeholder engagement processes so we get an agreed vision for these things as well? And would this put planning more central, and therefore think we would make sure we didn't just work within our silos, but looked around our silos and across our silos as well, this sort of spatial thinking. It would always also allow us, I think, to link the vision which we can put forward to delivery, because community plans and SOAs have a resource element to them, whereas development plans quite often are divorced from the resources. So what we could do if we link these things together more is take a much more rounded approach, and one which links the vision to delivery as well, by linking those resources, and I think that's really quite important. This is something that in RTPI we're looking at quite seriously. We've actually just started undertaking some research on that, and we've put out a call for evidence, asking people to tell us about how we can make spatial planning and community planning work together more effectively. And with the call for evidence is asking for people to give us examples of where there are barriers, where there are opportunities to link things, as well as good practice examples which we can follow up. And we're going to do more work on that. We'll be talking to community planning managers, we're talking to heads of planning. There's a real interest in it in government as well. So if we can get these recommendations from this to feed into it, it could hopefully make people think about a spatial way, which I think will go some way to providing that context for us to start thinking about how we join things up across silos, which I think is incredibly important. I think the idea of spatial thinking is being developed to an extent. We're starting to see Scottish Government planning attempting to do this, and trying to better relate what it does to the outcomes focused framework which we're working within. This table here is from, I think it's Scottish Planning Policy, Universal Scottish Planning Policy and the National Planning Framework, which shows how we fit into the broader governance issue, which, to be honest with you, as a planning profession, we've quite often ignored. So it's just trying to show where we fit into that, and I think that's really good. We, of course, RTPI, tried to push that a bit further, and we tried to do some thought to leadership, as it's called. And we had proposed at the very, very start of the National Planning Framework process that we should build a National Planning Framework based around 10 outcomes. Sustainable Scotland, Deliverable Scotland, I'll not read them all out, they're on the screen. But trying to do that because we felt that would be a good starting point for policy approaches. It would move us away from a topic or a subject basis. It would be a much more sophisticated way of doing it. It would be much more difficult, I appreciate, but ultimately we think it would be more effective. So this idea of trying to take that outcomes-based approach, that spatial approach, is important. And it works both ways. It's about us trying to promote that to others, and others seeing the value of taking that spatial approach as well. The third challenge in this, or opportunity, is if we get these frameworks right, there is a real need to make sure that we can ensure planners and those of us involved across the built environment firstly have the skills and the knowledge to actually make these frameworks work. Secondly, that they have the attitude and the approach in place which can make it work as well. And thirdly, they're allowed to use these skills, these knowledge sets and these approaches. And as everyone will know, there is a culture change programme in place in planning across Scotland to try and make the profession much more proactive and upstream, what we're trying to deliver, to be much more of an enabler and a facilitator, to be much more solutions focused and come up with ideas on how we can make things work. And through that requires much more collaboration, which is key to what we're talking about today. So that idea of solutions focused, enabling, but working with others in a collaborative way is incredibly important as well. There's a thing about how we can show how we can add that value through doing that process as well. It's really, really important. And as part of the process, we need to try and make us a profession and a group of professionals who are creative, or are allowed to be creative in their approaches to this. As I said earlier on, this is all about trying to create great places for people. And we should be using all the tools we have at our disposal, not just the system, it's the other things we have there as well. So that's incredibly important. And I think this culture change is really important because it's starting to show, well, we're starting to show that it's starting to happen. This is some research which was published by RICS about a year or so ago, which is showing that people are starting to think about the role of planners as changing, which is putting us in a much more positive seat, which would allow us to therefore put forward this idea that we can provide solutions to these broader issues which we talked about earlier on. Of course, as part of that, we need to support planners and others, like corporate management teams and counsellors, need support to try and make sure that they can actually make that change. And I've got a wee issue with that just now in that if people remember, we used to have the planning development programme, which was about £1.5 million, which was invested in culture change. We're not doing that. We're talking a lot about culture change now, but I don't think we're investing in it as much as we perhaps should, because the planning development programme is gone. What we now have is the Improvement Service, Heads of Planning Scotland and the Scottish Government doing their best, admittedly, to try and make things work, but with a much, much reduced resource. You're talking about £100,000 a year rather than the £1.5 million we had earlier. And that's bringing out some interesting things because we're getting much more experiential learning where people are learning from one another and changing things as well. But I think there's a real need to try and make sure that we do invest much more in this culture change, otherwise it won't happen. People are talking about transformational change. Transformational change depends upon some investment in trying to help people to make that change as well. And the other really important thing about this is one of my slight criticisms of the planning development programme was it spent a lot of money training up individual planners to do certain things, increase their knowledge in certain things, talk to them about different ways of doing things, which was great, really good. But what tended to happen was, or what could happen, is they went back to their organisation and said, I've got this great idea how to do this, and the organisation say, that's not how we do it here. So there's a need, if we do want to invest in culture change, that we invest not just in the individual, but we invest in the organisation as well. That's incredibly important that we do that. So we need to grasp that challenge as well. So, and that would go some way, I think, if we create a different culture for planning, a different role for planning, it would put us in a better forward-facing seat, which would allow us to pull the strings and bring different people together and therefore hopefully push that idea of a much more holistic approach which works across different silos and different boundaries. And my fourth challenge stroke opportunity is about thinking how we measure success. I think there's no doubt that actions and activities are often dependent upon what your priorities are and what you're measuring to show how good you've done or how poorly you've done. So having a performance framework which recognises the value of working across different sectors, which takes a very holistic approach to things, is incredibly important. And that's why I'm delighted that Heads of Planning Scotland and Scottish Government have developed the Planning Performance Framework for planning authorities in Scotland, where there are these 8 different hallmarks of success, and they have to report to these different success factors, 8 different indicators. Very holistic, encourages cross-sectoral working, cross-professional working. It's not just measuring planning in terms of process or speed. Speed's important, undoubtedly, but it's looking at the outcomes which we provide, which we try to achieve, and looks at all the other different ways in which we work as a profession, or how local authorities work as an organisation. And I think that's incredibly important. So, just finishing up. Hopefully that's giving you a sort of context for how I think we can make it work. I think there's some responsibilities on different people to take this forward. There are responsibilities on us all as individuals. We need to start showing where we add value, where we add benefit, what role we can play, how we can contribute to different outcomes, and how we can work with others in a collaborative way to develop that. I think there's also an important role for the organisations which people work within. They have to recognise and listen to planners and planning to see the things which we can do, which we can provide them with, which will hopefully help them to achieve their own aspirations. So they need to look at the benefit, the opportunities, the value, the roles which we can play, and they need to put in place systems which allow for that creative culture to come out as well. I think it's incredibly important. I think the other area where there's, or organisation where there's an onus and a responsibility upon is Scottish Government, to try and make sure that they continue to create that context. And I think they've done a good job with the outcome-based approach, because I think that gives us the opportunities to think much more about how we can work collaboratively to deliver things as well. I appreciate this isn't easy. As I said earlier, these are complex issues and they require complex solutions. And I think what it means is we have to take a much more sophisticated approach, as I said earlier, which makes it more difficult, but which makes it more effective in the end as well. And I'll leave you with a quote, I've not got it on the screen, but a quote which I use a lot, which shows that this is difficult but it's ultimately rewarding, and it's from a book called Generation X by Douglas Copeland, and the quote is, "You must choose between pain and drudgery." And I think we should always be trying to choose the pain option. So thanks very much.